in defense of monuments. Why we should not tear down statues, destroy monuments, or change historical names too hastily. Background. In recent years, there have been cultural movements in which the civic rights of a group or segment of the population which has suffered some indignity during a period or point of history has been celebrated, amplified, and affirmed through vocal engagement and sustained protests in the public realm. These civic rights being in principle life, liberty, and happiness, as we in America identify with them. In addition to these rights, which we arguably take for granted, having never lived entirely without them, is freedom from indignities and freedom from imposed upon inequalities. I refer to, quote, the Me Too movement of recent acclaim, and contemporaneously Black Lives Matter. Both of these movements are rebellions in a sense. That's neither a good nor bad quality, but merely an assertion of independence, and also an expression of grievance. But to state this is to state what we already know. And while the ends are justified, for these are the same ends that underpin the American experience from our inception, the striving toward independence, the form of that expression merely changing and reasserting itself as the fabric of the nation changes, as a quilt of many peoples changes. While the ends are justified, the means, in my view, appear clumsy and lacking a deepness in thought and a nuanced consideration of the complexity of the historical. That is, the means are rooted more in emotion than in deliberation. What I see superficially is a desire to erase history rather than add our current perspective to it. In my view, one can appreciate that Me Too toppled some who were well worthy of derision, abusers in those cases. But the momentum of that movement also toppled, in my view, some good people who did not deserve to be tarnished by the broad, one-size-fits-all paintbrush of derision and judgment of the moment. We lost Garrison Keillor, who was guilty of putting a hand on a woman's back during a group photo, and Senator Al Franken, who was found guilty of a tasteless prank that occurred while he was a comedian with another comedian. In our haste, the guillotine of quick judgment toppled public figures who were as flawed as the rest of us. No one is perfect all the time. Their actions should be judged in a historical context, and whether they have changed or have a willingness to do so now, and whether one incident was part of a broad pattern or is just one incident. Now we are at another such inflection point, the ends of which I do not disagree with. The ends are the same which define the American struggle against tyrannies which grew out of the rebellion against monarchy. But some of the means, like other such recent movements, the guillotine and the broad paintbrush, when rooted in emotion, I regret, miss the mark as often as not and topple figures of American history which for both good and ill are part of our legacy. We can learn from our legacy, or we can erase our legacy. In recent days, statues and commissioned art of past presidents, Ulysses S. Grant, without whom our Union would not have won the war which ended slavery, Christopher Columbus, without whom it might be argued the expression of liberty for all might not have flowered in the American colonies had the path to colonization not been opened by Columbus, a historical good inextricably entangled with the undeniable ills of that time period, those figures face their own injustices in the heat of today's passions. We put them on the chopping block and tear them down, when we should instead carefully disentangle the varied threads of their lives to discern what was great from what was a great injustice. And we can add to those monuments in our heritage instead of tearing it down so that we forget. The heat of passion pillories some long-cherished historical figures. If we were inquisitive, we should ask, though we see some negative through today's lens, what else did he or she do in their life? What was the intent of this statue, painting, or name in the first place? Was the intent to exemplify a negative characteristic? A Confederate loyalty, for example? To celebrate a power imbalance for its own sake? If yes, then the guillotine is warranted. Taking it down is warranted. But if the intent of the name or artwork or statue is to celebrate good things that arose from other parts of a person's life, such as exploration, courage, tenacity, perseverance, saving the Union, then we should be careful. To hold historical figures to ideals of 100% perfection based on the standards of current sentiment is to hold all people to a standard that can never be met through time. It is to turn a blind eye to the complexities of life, the patchwork imperfection, the canvas by which we try to form a more perfect union with the good entangled with the bad. I have read the term recently, the so-and-so, for example, Ulysses S. Grant, enslaved people. In historical fact, this is a misnomer. Rather than being a slaver, he was a slave owner. Grant did not round up free people and make them slaves. This is the difference between being a fossil fuel executive or a lobbyist, that is advocating and perpetuating a destructive endeavor, and merely driving a car to work or flying for vacation, that is participating in a destructive endeavor. It's a nuanced distinction, but a valid distinction. I think in the current era, we are taking a cudgel to history rather than trying to understand the bad and good aspects of human nature in a nuanced way. This would be like 50 years from now, anyone who flew in a plane or drove a car today would be pilloried because of our contribution to global warming. Everyone is swept up in the currents of their own time to some degree. How can we condone that we each in some way made the world, the future world for our grandchildren, uninhabitable by our road trips and vacations today? No person alive today, except perhaps the Amish, would ever be worthy of a statue or painting. So in summary, all people are made up of an intertwinement of good and bad aspects. All people, including us today, are bound by the currents of our own time period for good and bad. Future generations will hold each of us responsible for the despoilment of the earth, by disposing of plastics which poison our water and food, and by driving in cars and flying in planes which carbonize our atmosphere and render the future world possibly uninhabitable. Knowing that individuals are made up of good and bad characteristics, we should add to our understanding of historical figures and monuments, calling out the great along with the tarnish, while certain other monuments, which might be symbols of terror, should be removed from public spaces to museums. Otherwise, the quick rush to judgment and holding to standards of 100% perfection of what some might call cancel culture will topple us all.